Welcome to Ignite Intimacy, a podcast exploring intimacy, romantic relationships, sexuality, and the all of everything that relates to these hot topics. We're going in. You ready? This is your host, Miss La. Let's do this. Hello, everyone. This is Miss La, and you are here for another Ignite Intimacy podcast episode. And I am really excited today because this is the second podcast that I've done with a couple, which I think is so cool because I have been religiously single in my adult life, and I love the world of relational experiences, which is why this podcast even exists. So I'm fascinated always to have couples around me and in my life and to kind of dive in with them about their own journey and how they're thriving and designing their relationships. And then also when couples work together, I think it's amazing, especially in the world of relational experiences. So I have an amazing couple with us on the line today, and I'm very excited to introduce them. So Chloe Urban and Neil Sattin are joining us for a very powerful topic today on Ignite Intimacy. And let me introduce them and then we'll get into the topic a little bit more. Chloe and Neil are the creators of the new loveparadigm.com. They recently launched their 7-week online course, Thriving Intimacy, which uses a signature system that they developed to deepen intimacy, improve communication, and turn your relationship into a source of energy and inspiration in your life. And I know I need that. I can assume some of you do too. So Chloe and Neil are the authors of a forthcoming book for helping couples create profound, deep intimacy when they are affected by sexual trauma. They work with couples and singles, both individually and together, to overcome obstacles to profound growth and connection in relationships. So it's all about deepening our relationships with ourselves and each other so that we can really create and design thriving, abundant, and fulfilling relationships. So Chloe is an infinity practitioner, healer, and dancer. Holler, I'm a dancer too, Chloe. That's so cool. We'll have to jam on that another time. So Chloe grew up steeped in nature, creativity, shamanism, and the medicine wheel. She has over 10 years of experience in healing work and specializes in combining energy medicine, movement, and inquiry to help people shine more brightly and become more fully embodied. And Neil Sattin is a relationship coach, trained in strategic intervention and conscious uncoupling, a writer and an infinity practitioner as well. Neil has over 15 years of experience in this field of relationship coaching and healing, and is also the host of the popular podcast Relationship Alive, where he talks to the world's experts on relationships and the topic of how to do love right. So I actually know about Neil through his podcast. My twin sister was like, I think you need to check out this guy, Neil Sattin. He's got this awesome podcast, Relationship Alive. And Neil is interviewing people like John Gottman, Catherine Woodward Thomas, Diana Richardson, Terry Real, Wendy Maltz, and many, many, many others. He's got over 50 episodes right now. You can check it on iTunes and elsewhere. But Neil is an incredible interviewer, and you will just gain so much knowledge from diving into these episodes. So I encourage you to check that out. But anyhow, welcome, Chloe and Neil. Thank you so much for being here with the Ignite Intimacy community today.
It's so great to be here.
So good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about your journey into the work that you've doing, especially with regards to relational experiences.
Yeah. Well, I would say both of us have background in just being really intrigued and inspired by what happens when two people come together and connect, especially on an intimate level. And I know for me, I have sort of this history or background in just really dysfunctional relationships. And just really struggling in that realm and knowing that something else was possible, but really having no idea how to get there. And part of that was, affected by my history of trauma, but it also was just affected by codependent patterns and learned patterns from my parents and society. And I think when I really knew I wanted to dive deeper into this subject and help others was really when I met Neil. And what we were able to do together just blew my mind. It was like it birthed this whole new way of doing relationship. And that's when it became clear that not only do I want to do healing work in the world, but it's also about joining the healing work and relational work together to create something different and make a difference in the world, especially when it comes to trauma.
Absolutely. Well, and so today for our community, we're going to be diving into deepening intimacy and the impact of trauma and sexual trauma on intimacy. So that is our topic for today. So, I mean, this is so dynamic when you can take an experience like sexual trauma and you can transform it and you can use it as fuel to offer support and guidance to others who are on that journey, because we all know there are a lot of people in the world that have dealt with sexual trauma in their lives. Unfortunately, I mean, this problem is kind of rampant. So I think that it's really powerful that we're going to dive into this topic today, because it's also a bit taboo, isn't it?
Definitely. Which is something that, we're trying to help transform that, because it really, to transform it, needs to come more to the forefront and be able to be talked about. So that's definitely part of our movement here.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, here in the States, there have been some notable events that have happened even over the past 6 months that have increased public awareness of the issue. But it's been an ongoing thing. And we also know that it's not a gendered thing, that, as many as 1 in 3 women deal with some sort of sexual assault or trauma, as many as 1 in 4, 1 in 5 men. And, never mind how many people experience the little kinds of things that you may not even think of as trauma. So it's not like a big, someone should be prosecuted kind of thing.
Yep.
But it's more like someone laughed at them at the wrong moment, or made fun of the way that they looked naked, or their experience of peer pressure, someone talking about them. Like, there are all these kinds of things that happen to us as part of our coming of age that affect us, and that we can actually experience as some form of trauma, which is, I think, just some way of saying that our system experiences shock or pain, and then we do something to accommodate that and to cope. And a split-second choice that we make at some point in the past can affect us for our entire lives if we don't revisit it in a way that actually allows for growth and healing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, and this is something that can just trail around with us or behind us and creating like a trail of chaos and destruction if we don't deal with it properly. So Neil, tell us just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive more fully into this topic.
Sure. So I am also the product of one dysfunctional relationship after another. Although while I was in it, I was really trying to make it as functional as it could possibly be. And I think we all are. I mean, that's part of it, is that we're all doing our best. And then the question around relationship, of course, is that how we've learned to do what we do is often just something that happened to us, or, that we picked up from our parents, or what we see in the culture, movies, books we read, etc., things that we witness in our friends. So that was me. And I was married for a while and have 2 lovely kids from my former partner, and had no desire to be divorced, but divorce happened, and eventually it was something that I chose, and that was a really amazingly transformative experience for me. And is, as much as I actually support people staying married, particularly in the work that I do as a relationship coach. And that being said, I'm also someone who's experienced the beauty of what lies on the other side, and whether that be my children having now 4 adults in their lives who can give them love and attention and help feed their growth, or just the feeling of what it's like to be with a partner where the way that we meet each other is truly inspiring and life-giving. It's a success story from that perspective.
I love that. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like flipping the script on it, right? Because ideally you want to believe that you can stay with the person that you at one time fell in love with and had children with, but as we see, that's not always the case. And there are many different reasons why those relationships don't work. But when you can look at it as like, well, now our kids have like even more of an abundance of love and connection and guidance from different angles and different perspectives with these new adults in their lives.
Exactly. And that all being said, Chloe and I are now engaged, and this is, it's very exciting. And, it wasn't perfect for us. And that's another really important part of the story, is that we spent the initial part of our relationship being in struggles that were very similar to relationships that we had each had in the past.
Interesting.
Until we had this moment, or several moments really, of just looking at each other and being like, what are we doing? Like, how do we get off of this hamster wheel of how we've always done relationship, and how do you take that feeling that we all feel when you fall in love with someone and you get that feeling of, wow, I could be with this person forever, and how do you translate that into a reality? And it requires new skills, new capacities, new ways of relating that we're not taught. And I know that's part of why you're having this podcast. It's part of why my podcast started. It's part of why we created the course that we did and are writing the book that we are. It's all part of like, what are the new skills that are actually going to get us past this endless repetition of unhealthy patterns, or the patterns that at least lead us out of really close connection and relating, and create new patterns that allow us to thrive when we're continuing that connection with each other.
Well, and that's like the goal in everything that we be and do in the world, right? Because we've all have past programming and things that were said or done to us or around us that created, helped us develop our own stories and issues and challenges and, things that for the most part, for many of us, have held us back in our lives, and have kept us in these cycles of a funky dynamic over the long term. So I'm curious what it's like to be in a relationship with a relationship coach, like how how that dynamic. So Chloe, maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it's great. It's great. Luckily, we have a lot of tools because, of course, we both could be analyzing each other all over the place, or, oh, you're doing that thing right now, and let's bring that, let's use this skill to break it down. And, we don't want to be coaching each other all the time. And yet both of us are so open and excited by showing up for each other as a coach or a healer, and really sessioning each other as well. And so it's been a beautiful journey in finding that balance of when it's time to hold space. And I think we actually do this really well of choosing the times where we're actually holding space for each other, of choosing the times where we're diving in and coaching or doing a healing session on one or the other of us, versus just being in life and showing up for each other in love and compassion and all of that, without it turning into like a dynamic of Neil's always coaching me, or I'm always, trying to do some clearings or healing things on him, or, so we've really found a balance, which has been, I think, key. But that being said, with all the books that Neil's read over the last year for the podcast and all the interviews, it's been incredible to see how those skills and tools that he reads about just really seamlessly seep into our dynamic and our relationship together. And I'm so grateful for it. And just to talk about the books a lot together and different things that inspired him when he was reading. And it's just been incredible to see how that has impacted us in such a positive way. And to be honest, I mean, we've really put into practice so many of the things that he's read, and also coaching practices and in our healing practice together, all of them, where it's sort of like our days are filled with different tidbits that we've picked up along the way. And I think that's part of what makes our relationship so strong and thriving.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm wondering, like, so one thing, and I am not the long-term romantic relationship expert because I haven't had a lot of long-term romantic relationships in my life. What I have realized is timing. There's a big thing around timing and like when you bring something up, right? So just that element of like, just, I guess, being a little bit strategic about when you actually presence an issue with someone, and then of course how you choose to present that issue. So before we really dive into the topic that we're going to talk about today, I'm just so interested in hearing just a little bit about maybe some of your favorite tools or some of the, the strategies or the things that you've learned along the way that tend to really work to bring you two together when something funky is going on.
Good question. You wanna answer it and then I'll chime in?
Okay.
Great.
Sure. So the first tool is always asking who goes first.
That's a good one.
And I think that what pops into my mind immediately will actually be really relevant to this conversation, and that's the way that we have figured out how to tell when each other is in a triggered state. So either when I'm triggered or when she is triggered, and finding ways, and we can talk about several of those ways in this conversation, finding ways to help each other navigate that, and recognizing that when you are triggered, pretty much nothing else is going to happen positive until you deal with the fact that you're triggered. That's not true 100% of the time, but probably 90% of the time that's true. So the ways that we've learned to really tune in to each other and perceive when that's happening, and then to make that what we deal with and what we respond to in the moment has been huge in getting us past those triggered moments to places where we're actually back online and healing with each other. Yeah.
I love that because, like one of you could just be hangry, right? Like hungry and angry.
Right.
And, so it's like, and you're just
me.
Yeah. Like, cause I'm usually the hangry one. So, maybe you're just getting triggered about something just because you're hungry and tired, or you just need some self-nourishment, right? So it may not actually be that issue. It could just be that the trigger of just needing to get into some self-care. And then,
exactly.
Once you fuel yourself, it's like, oh gosh, all of a sudden that thing doesn't feel so big anymore.
Right. And then the problem being that when you're triggered, you're already in fight, which can lead to arguments and hangriness. Or you're in flight where you're kind of checking out or not participating anymore in whatever's happening right there in the moment, or you're freezing and not even sure what to do. And none of those states lead to good relating. So whatever you can do to recognize that that's what you're in, and then it could be as simple as getting a bite to eat. It could be as simple as sharing some breathing together. There are any number of techniques that help bring you back online. But the goal, the main skill being just recognizing, oh yeah, this is going on. And if we try to move further without dealing with this, then we're just making our lives way more difficult.
Yeah, you're still the hamster on the wheel.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So our topic today, addressing the ability to deepen intimacy with ourselves and each other, especially when someone has experienced some level of sexual or even like intimate trauma. This is a very powerful subject, because I would guess that this particular piece is one of the biggest pieces that probably breaks up like so many different relationships. So we touched on earlier that sexual trauma is not always cut and dry, right? It can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and ways and at different ages in our lives. So I think I would assume that there are probably a lot of people walking around planet Earth right now that wouldn't even consider that they've been traumatized in sexual ways, but most likely have been. I know for myself, I have been, but I didn't realize that I had been until later in my life that, oh, that situation right there, that was not okay. And, so there's some trauma there that I've had to deal with and that I'm still just taking a look at because it's a kind of a new uncovering for me. So talk to me a little bit about when you guys got together in your own relationship and something's coming to me. I was a total hellion teenager and ended up in a lot of trouble when I was a teen. And I had to go through a program. And I remember my counselor saying that it was totally inappropriate to talk with your romantic partner about any sexual trauma that you had been through in your life. And that has stuck with me because I found it very confusing. Like, why would I not you know what I mean? Like, so I'd like to know just a little bit about your journey, into your relationship with each other and sort of the uncovering of some of these more delicate issues as you were deepening your own intimacy and getting to know each other now to, where you're engaged and you're really creating a family together.
It's a great question. I think, well, for me, who is the one, we have this saying the big T trauma and the little T trauma. And the little T traumas are kind of the ones that Neil was addressing earlier of just, you might not know, but really it wasn't quite okay, or you got laughed at, or whatever it is. And then there's the obvious trauma of, assault or rape or whatever it is. But I have always been someone to really just come right out with it in the beginning because it did so affect how I showed up in my relationships. So I think that came out pretty early on. That being said, for me, there's sort of different layers. I had trauma when I was actually really young and then trauma when I wasn't so young. And I had some amnesia. And I think a lot of people with trauma do. Like, it's like, oh, they know something happened, but it kind of, as a protection, we kind of forget, or our minds just sort of blank out that particular piece. So as we deepened in our relationship, I think more and more of it started to uncover for me. And I got a little bit more clear on what had happened in these particular moments and why why certain things were triggering me so much, which was really helpful. But I think that in general, I've been kind of an open book about it and really wanting for that to be out in the open. So it's just so interesting that you would have been told that, and actually really makes me kind of cringe, because so much of what we've been talking about and sort of our vision is to spread this work to teens as well. And that to really start the conversation young, because that's what's going to shift. That's what's going to shift the numbers. That's what's going to shift the 1 in 5 and the 1 in 3. And I think it's huge. So it's such a kind of shocking thing to hear that was something you were told.
When I heard that, my first reaction was, well, that person was wrong. Then I started to think a little bit more about it, and it made me realize that it's not like the flip side is necessarily true. It's not like you necessarily do want to just like spill everything to your partner. In fact, one of the real important aspects of the work that we do, particularly around this topic, but around relationship in general, is working on the integrity of the container of your relationship. And so you have to have a container that can really support that conversation. And I can even relate back to when I was first learning about that part of Chloe's history, when the only tools that I really had to deal with it were my own anger and frustration and feeling so powerless at the same time that someone that I loved and cared about so deeply had been through these kinds of experiences. Mm-hmm. It was a very impassioned place to be experiencing it, but it wasn't very useful or helpful mm-hmm. in terms of our relationship to be there, mm-hmm. except maybe for Chloe seeing that I really cared about her a lot. So it wasn't until later that we really had the skills and the container in place to not only handle that information, but to resolve it, to deal with it in a way that actually mm-hmm. became productive in our relationship, as opposed to something that just created confusion and at times actually made us feel more separate from each other. So that's an important part of how it's addressed in a couple. If you don't have those skills, then I could see, a counselor saying, well, maybe you wouldn't want to talk about that right now, but hopefully then they follow up by saying, and here are some of the skills and things that need to be in place in order for you to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. So you can be fully mm-hmm. known by your partner, fully experienced by your partner, and have true intimacy, which is about really knowing each other and experiencing what it's like to be fully seen and loved at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and then I would also assume just like, when might be a good time to bring it up. So what are some of the things that you want to know about your relationship before you broach that topic with someone, right? Because like you don't necessarily want to tell someone on a second date, you know what I mean? And a lot of that is just like knowledge of self, right? So just being aware of when it feels like, okay, now is the right time to broach this topic or to share this thing about my past. So I wondered if you two could walk us through, because I know you're launching this online course and it's steeped in deepening your intimacy, dealing with different types of traumas. And so what would be kind of like the first few steps for a couple? Like, how would you guide a couple that's dealing with something like this? Like maybe one of the partners has dealt with sexual trauma in their past and they are just shut down when it comes to deepening the intimacy in their relationship. How would you, what would be some of the initial ways that you would guide that couple and just, I guess, coming to maybe just a level playing field so that you have something to work with and then move forward into that deepening of the intimacy?
Yeah. So the very first step of our system that we are teaching people is called alignment, and it has some subcomponents to it. So those things that fall into the category of alignment are things like developing your own presence. So how aware are you of what's happening in your own body, in your own experience, in your own emotions as you interact with the world and specifically as you interact with your partner? And then how much are you aware of how your experience shifts in relationship to your partner? So that's a really important piece. Then there's also the piece of working on your communication. So there are a number of ways that you can actually learn the skills of communicating around easy topics, like, for instance, how much you appreciate your partner, or what they're sparking in you, or what you're noticing about yourself in relation to them. There are all these ways to try things out in a less complicated context. So it's easier to talk about the ways that you feel good or inspired, hopefully. And then that lays the foundation for how you communicate about more complicated topics, like what we're talking about right now, or even really anything that potentially creates conflict, like, I wish you'd actually follow through on taking the compost out every Sunday. Like, those kinds of things can also be really contentious if they're not communicated in the right way. So there are skills of communication that are about bringing the present you that I was just talking about a moment ago into and actually being able to start to be more in relationship through how you communicate about your experience and what you appreciate, what frustrates you, those kinds of things. Or even how you communicate when you notice your partner isn't present. So you notice the other has checked out or whatever. How do you communicate that about that in a way that's helpful? And then, Chloe, do you want to talk about the container piece a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned this earlier, but that the third sort of step in the alignment process is really creating a strong container. So that is, for me, was so key in really feeling safe enough to open up and to really dive deep into the healing process, which is sort of the next step of our system. But with the container, that is really about honing in where it is that we are exiting the relationship. You know, for me, it was always, I had one foot out the door. It was just, I couldn't fully 100% just be a yes to the relationship for whatever reason. I was terrified of being vulnerable and doing all of the things that it took to really fully show up for myself and for the relationship. And so when we really realized that without the container, without the safety of the container, that we weren't going to be able to grow. We weren't going to be able to thrive. And so it took quite a bit of honing that and having conversations about, like, what are our agreements? What is it that I do to exit? And how, like, really honing in on what's the container that you and I are creating? Because every person, every relationship has a different set of agreements. But for us, we realized that that was absolutely key in this first step of alignment, which really the whole alignment step is about creating safety and is kind of the bedrock, the foundation for creating a thriving relationship. And so it's anything from how do I exit? So I'm exiting just by maybe feeding a little flirtation with the guy at the coffee shop every Wednesday that I go to work at. Or maybe that's, well, porn is actually a big one in relationship. We could go way into that topic. But again, that's a way that people can exit. Or it might be flirtations online, or it might just be I use work to I'm too afraid to face what it's going to take for me to really show up in this relationship, so I'm going to put all my energy and attention on work or raising our children or whatever it is. There are so many different ways in which our attention can be pulled from our relationship. And so it's really about having the conversations with the prior step of communication, having those conversations. What is it that makes me feel safe in this? What is it that really shows me, and how can I really show you that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere? And whether or not, you know, some people, for us, it was like we were breaking up and we realized that the only way we were going to at all thrive in our relationship is if we created a container, a safe container. And so, you know, just honing and talking about the different ways in which, and being honest and vulnerable in that, like, oh, babe, I actually check out when you speak about this certain thing because it makes me feel really vulnerable and that makes me uncomfortable. So I actually think about everything I have to do tomorrow or whatever it is. Like, and so just how to really create that safety and get clear. Like, you know, actually, I'm going to choose to not watch porn for 60 days and see how that energy that was seeping in that way out of our relationship, how I can feed that back into our relationship. Or, oh, actually, to be honest, I find myself, you know, checking men out on the street or checking women out in the coffee shop or going to that yoga class because I get that little spark in me when I see that person. And just being honest about that and even saying 30 days, let's try this out. What would it be like if we fully stepped in, both feet into this relationship, this container, and took all that energy and fed it back into the system of our relationship?
Yeah.
That was a long-winded description.
Well, I love that. How can we take the energy that we expend avoiding the relationship and avoiding like the real meaty, you know, the juice of the relationship? How can we actually take all of that energy and channel it into the relationship to feed it and uplift it and nurture it?
Yes.
Yeah,
I
and
love
what popped into my mind too, Chloe, while you were talking about that was how what comes hand in hand with that safety is the level of trust in your partner that's required to take on something that's challenging.
Yes.
Like being triggered when you're having sex with each other, which is actually really challenging. And it's especially challenging if you don't have that foundation of really knowing that the other person is there, so
Right.
that you can depersonalize a lot of what happens and then just deal with it in the moment.
Well, and that's a juicy topic right there. I'd love to touch on because we have, I would, I'm going to assume that more people than not already have a difficult time just saying like, oh, could you go a little slower, or could you, whatever it is, like move over just a little bit, or do this or do that. Like there's already an issue just communicating on a basic level when it comes to sex and sexuality and our sexual intimacy with each other in relationships. So, I mean, can you talk us through some of the, add the layer of sexual trauma to that? And I could imagine it complicates things entirely. So, how do you guide couples in, so you're noticing the trigger, right? But if you're in the heat of the moment, what would be some tools or some guidance that you could give some of our listeners for how to let someone know that you're being triggered while you're in the heat of the moment?
Great question. Great question. And I'm just going to start by saying that really this journey, when there's trauma, it's so important to acknowledge that it's really about being partners in the healing. It's really about both sides. Whether I'm the one with the big T trauma and you're either have no trauma or have the little T trauma, it's really about acknowledging that it's a journey for the person with the trauma, but it's also a huge healing journey for the person without the big T trauma, and how to support both of you, because it's as challenging to be the one who is in the heat of the moment and to receive like, oh, I just got triggered, I'm totally checked out, my trauma kicked in, or whatever it is, than to be the one to say it, And so there's this really important aspect of finding compassion for both sides and really yes, I mean, when you have big T trauma, it can feel like your world is caving in, or there's so much rage that you're balancing with pleasure or vulnerability, or, all the triggers you may feel in your body in different ways, or all of it. And just really, I think it's so important as that person to also be able to see the other side of it, and that your partner who's fully showing up here for you is also probably gonna feel some trigger sometimes and make it personal, even though it may have nothing to do with it being personal. And, in the beginning stages, just being gentle with each other and noticing like, this is a hard topic to broach, and these are things that are challenging, and how can we be the most compassionate, the most loving, and have empathy for both sides? So that, I just wanted to kind of lay that out first. And did you have another question?
Absolutely. And it all goes back to the container,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And so let's just unpack that a little bit, because just for some of our audience members that our listeners that might not understand that terminology. So can you give us like a visual on what it's like? I mean, I know we talked about a set of agreements, but, can you just paint a picture for us about what it looks like to create a container, a safe container with your romantic partner?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it brings up one of the greatest paradoxes, I think, that happens in committed relationship, which is that the stronger your container is, the more free you actually feel to explore your relationship, to live your life to more freely,
to be who you are.
To be who you are, exactly.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about is like, it's not like you're building this box that you don't, and now you're confined.
Right.
Like that's not what we're talking about. Yeah, sorry about that. That's just a side effect. So this is good.
It's not a coffin. It's not a coffin, right?
No.
Right.
It's a moving, living, breathing container, or like it's an orb.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A very dynamic orb. It's actually more like a foundation. And it's like the idea that if you just like throw some posts in the ground and build your house on it, then those posts like are gonna, like, one might sink because it's on mud, and then, you know, one shifts because of the frost, and like next thing you know your house is lopsided. Or no foundation, and some, you know, big bad wolf comes along and just like pushes it right off, pushes the house sideways or something like that. I don't know why the big bad wolf came into my mind, but anyway, but when you have a solid foundation, then it can withstand, you're looking for something that can withstand the forces that are happening within your relationship. So the way that conflict comes up, the way that you can get triggered, the way you can get really passionate, so that you want a foundation where whatever happens in the melting pot of your relationship, that you don't find yourself leaving the relationship because of it. Like, you know, I got too scared because I felt like you were going to see this part of me that I don't want anyone to see. So I left. Like, those are the kinds of things that you want to have some agreements around, so that you might say, oh, there's actually room in our relationship for you to be scared, and I'm not going to force you anywhere, or, you know, we're not going to, like, there's nothing required here other than to really honor each other and agree, for instance, to be present with each other. So if you're feeling really scared, then it might actually be an exit to try to fix that fear. Like, oh, it's not okay for you to be scared. Like, let me fix that for you. As opposed to just saying like, wow, you're really scared right now. Can I hold you? And can you just be scared? And you know what, when I'm feeling your fear, like, I start to get scared. Like, I worry, like, maybe you'll leave me because you're scared. It's impossible to have those conversations if it's like, well, you know, I got too scared, so I just can't do that anymore. I'm out the door, you know? Like, if out the door is always an option, and it is always an option in the big picture, right? But it's more like, I like when Chloe mentioned the could we agree for 30 days? And I think that's directed more at couples who are on the fence, or, you know, have had that experience of like, well, I do have a foot out the door in some respects. Then you get that experience of like, okay, what happens when I take that off the table for just like a limited time? And so I can get that experience without panicking because it's forever. But over time, and with the right level of commitment to growth, and that's another great agreement, is just saying like, we're going to agree that when things come up that are hard, that we will both get creative and try to figure out solutions when that feels right. Like, not in a now we're going to fix it kind of way, like getting back to what I was saying earlier, but in a like, we're just going to hold that there will be times that it's hard, and our commitment is to being resourceful and curious and
humility about that, and being willing to do what it takes to grow. Do what it takes to look at our shadows, do what it takes to show up fully.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly is that a solid foundation or container also withstands forces from the outside. So like, you know, the frost heaves or the earthquake, or in terms of relationship, other people like making attempts to break apart a relationship, or the forces of work or kids or whatever it is. Like, that solid container allows you to keep each other safe no matter what is happening in the internal environment of your relationship, or the external environment of how the world meets your relationship.
Yes. Well, and all of this is deepening intimacy in the relationship, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what I'm thinking right now is like, I'm going back to and this woman was absolutely amazing, helped me really begin my healing journey when I was 16. But I think about what she said, and I think that probably she was saying that to teenagers from a perspective of like, don't go telling like your high school boyfriend that you had some sexual trauma. Like I can imagine that maybe that's more along the lines of what she may have been thinking. I don't know, but I do know now as a grown ass woman, like, so we're talking about two grown, mature adults coming together in a relationship that are ready, willing, and able to take the ride together and take the journey with, as we know, all of life's ebbing and flowing and highs and lows and everything in between. I mean, it is a dynamic and ever changing journey. And so you've got to have two willing, able, mature adults coming to the table saying, yes, we desire to deepen our intimacy, and we've got this issue of sexual trauma, and it keeps presenting this challenge or these challenges. How do we deal with this so that we can deepen our relationship and our intimacy with each other to further nurture and grow the relationship into a more thriving and fulfilling relationship? So I love that, this is all, I mean, it's like, how can you deepen intimacy with someone when they don't know about something very significant in your life that continues to trigger you and create challenges? So if you're not speaking on that, there's always something hidden. And there's always a missing piece of that puzzle, right? So
yeah, and I love how you just unpacked that, your experience with that counselor when you were 16. It's just an example of how we can hear something and make meaning out of it at any point in our lives, and we just kind of internalize that, and without having a way of actually looking back and being like, okay, wait a minute, what did that person actually mean in that moment anyway? And okay, I could see how that could be appropriate in that context, but that doesn't necessarily mean that now in my adult life that is the rule I should live by. I mean, so many people, that is how they live. They learned a rule when they were 10 about how love should be, and that's what they're still living by. Yeah.
Well, so you're on a mission to really shift the cultural dynamic around, assault and trauma as it relates to our ability to deepen intimacy with ourselves and our loved ones. So I just so fully honor this mission because, we know that sexual abuse and sexual trauma it has touched, if it hasn't directly touched you, it most likely has touched someone in your immediate family or the next layer of your family. I mean, it's everywhere. So I so honor your choice to dive into this, hot and delicate topic and experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And I'm wondering, so in addition to your the work that you're doing in the world, what would be some other resources that you would recommend, whether they're books or specific program or like a sort of like a healing modality, or what have you find that has been useful that might be helpful to some of our audience members?
The ones that come to me right away, one being, Diana Richardson, who she does a lot of work with Tantra. And she's written, 6, 7 books. And for me, that particular piece, she doesn't necessarily, she does actually speak directly to trauma in some of the books. And some of them, she doesn't necessarily speak directly to it. And yet, the way in which she approaches sexuality completely transformed our intimacy and our ability to show up fully. And she actually talks a lot about, she has even a video called Slow Sex, but she talks a lot about non-orgasmic sex and how that can really shift the dynamic in not only in the bedroom, but also in your life. And that's another huge piece of some of the healing work that we do with people with trauma, is just really like broadening intimacy, not just into like the bedroom and sex as an act, but also bringing that sexual energy and quality into our every moment and how to feed that with each other. And so she really dives deep into that. And I think that's an amazing resource. Also, Wendy Maltz, she wrote a book called
The Sexual Healing Journey, I think is her book. Yeah.
And that is like a real guide to really amazing work around sexual trauma. And she has a whole 30-day program that's in that book, that different steps to help couples and healing trauma. And
yeah, I think she also, because she just recently retired, she was on my podcast, but she recently retired. Yeah, it's like episode 4 or 5 on my podcast. It's very early, but I think she just made her relearning touch videos freely available through her website. So for this particular topic around sexual intimacy and how partners can repattern the way that they experience sensual touch, her work is really great for that, and has definitely been a huge influence on the work that we do with people.
And lastly,
I love that.
Maybe just mentioning Peter Levine.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Just him.
Yeah. So if you don't know Peter Levine, his work it's called Somatic Experiencing. He wrote a book called Waking the Tiger, and he's written several other books about the experience of trauma. And he has a book called Healing Trauma that is put out by Sounds True, and it's a very short book with an accompanying CD with some exercises. And so that is all about, again, how trauma gets stored in the body and how you repattern your responses to the things that resurface the trauma. So these 3 people that we've mentioned, along with many other people, are like, that's work that we've synthesized into the work that we do because their work is so powerful.
I love that. Well, and then I know that you're actually launching a course today, the day we're recording this, but by the time this podcast airs, the course will already be launched. But where can people find out about the work that you're doing in this area?
Yeah, we have our website, which is the newloveparadigm.com. And there you'll find info about us and our work. There'll also be the course page. You can read about the course that we do. And this is kind of our beta launch, and then we'll have it available. The course will be available to purchase on our website once it's finished and recorded and all of that.
Yeah, and to be clear, the course it's not specifically geared at people with trauma. The course is more, it's called Thriving Intimacy, and it's just a 7-week course for couples to take them through all of the steps of our system. And one of those steps is, well, we talked about 3 of them here in this conversation. And one of them at the next level, which is the healing level, is overcoming triggers. So even in relationships where people haven't had any kind of trauma, there still are triggers, and it still represents work that's really important for people to be able to get to the next place in their relationship, which is about how you awaken as partners, how you really nurture your spiritual connection with each other, and what you do in your love and relationship ripples out into the world around you. So yeah, so the overcoming triggers part is a key part of that. So that's available on our website. Also, I have my own website for the podcast. You can just go to relationshipalive.com. And then if there are a couple ways for people who are listening, if you want to get a little sample of our work, you can text the word possible to the number 33444, and there's a free guided meditation that Chloe and I put together that's all about how to take things that are causing pain in your relationship and to turn it into new energy for what's actually possible in your relationship. So that's the first thing. And then if you text the word relationship to that same number, 33444, then I have a free guide that's all about how to really discover your core needs in relationship and your partner's core needs, and how to use that in a way that actually supports your growth and happiness. And that's free as well. So those are a few good ways for people to find us and interact with us.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got thenewloveparadigm.com. Paradigm can be one of those tricky words to spell, so Google it if you're unsure. But the New Love Paradigm, PARADIGM.com. That is their Chloe and Neil's collective work together. And then neilsattin.com, NEILSATTIN.com, and then relationshipalive.com. And Relationship Alive is Neil's amazing podcast. I highly, highly recommend that you check it out. Neil, where can folks find your podcast aside from your website?
Well, if they search in iTunes or Stitcher, or it should be available in most of those places where you find podcasts. But if they search on Relationship Alive or on Neil Sattin, it should show up. And I should mention, too, that along with Wendy Maltz, both Diana Richardson and Peter Levine have also been guests on the podcast. So another great way to learn more about their work.
Amazing. Well, and you have in the 50 or so podcasts that you've recorded so far, you've got some powerhouses in the world of relational dynamics and experiences. So it's just, there's a wealth of information there. I highly recommend checking that out. And then you can also text 33444 with either the word possible or the word relationship to get some free goodies and goodness from Chloe and Neil. So I'm just curious if you could, before we sign off here today, if someone that's listening to this podcast hasn't broached this topic yet with their partners, so they've experienced some sort of sexual trauma, they're hurting and aching and suffering in some way inside, and they haven't yet shared this with their partner, could you just give us like a first step? Like, what would you recommend as just sort of a first step to just dip their toes in the water of, opening up and beginning to talk about that and share that with their partner so that they can have a more intimate and connected and dynamic relationship?
Yeah, great question. First I would just say that it's so different for every person. Obviously, some people it's extremely hard to talk about, and others it's a little less. And yet, I think it is obviously a very important thing to address if you think you're going to be long-term or really just intimately involved with a person that you want to go deeper with, because without addressing it, how can you really get to the deeper parts of intimacy and vulnerability and the sweetness that can come from all of that? So I would say, first off, make sure to not necessarily be in the act of making love. Second off, make sure both of you to be in a place that isn't triggered, as we spoke about before. Seeing if you could either just say, hey, there's something I want to talk to you about. Is there a way we could schedule a time where we can both be really present with each other? Or, just making sure that it's not just like off the cuff while you're making dinner, or, really creating a stage that's safe and where you both are able to be present with each other. And then, that is just setting the framework for actually having a good conversation where you might actually feel held and heard in that regard. And then, as hard as it is, it's just really about saying, hey, something happened to me or has happened more than once. And I've noticed in the past that it's impacted how I show up in my relationships. It's impacted how I show up as a sexual partner. And, whether you feel the need to get really in detail or not. For me, I wasn't even able to get in detail for a long time because I had gone and, I had that amnesia. So I just said, I know that this particular thing happened when I was young. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I know that it's affected me. And I know that my body, still stores that. And I just want you to know so that we can show up for that, and because it will impact you as much as it will impact both of us in this relationship. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, two things that I feel are really important to mention. One is that if you are the person to whom something has happened and you're talking about it, I think it's also helpful to create a context, like the reason we're having this conversation is because I love you so much, because I feel so connected with you, because I want you to know even this about me, and I'm hoping that this can be a way for us to grow even closer through your knowing this about me. And if there's a particular way that you want your partner to respond to you, because like in my situation, like I said, I was angry and I was like, let's get revenge. It's helpful, I think, for your partner to hear what would be helpful for you. So it would be helpful if you just held me right now, or if you could, that you still love me and that I'm okay in your eyes. Or as challenging as it may be to make that kind of request, it's so helpful for a partner who may very well not really know how to respond. And then if you're that partner and you're listening to this podcast, then it might be helpful to ask, like, how can I help you right now? Or how can I show you how much I love you and care about you right now? If it's not obvious, because it probably will be if you can just be open and receptive, and more likely than not, the simpler your response, the better. Just being able to hold your partner in their vulnerability and reassure them how much you care about them. And even you can be honest, like, wow, that's really hard to hear, or that's really shocking. And I need to process that information. And I think if not 100%, at least 99% of the people out there are going to be like, and I love you so much. And they
I'm
will,
here.
and I'm here. I will feel, and they'll feel that connection deepening just from that information being revealed.
And as far as, so Neil, you're on the other side of it, right? So could you just speak for a moment to what happens if the person receiving the information gets really triggered by that? What would be, what if all of a sudden their relationship to the situation shifts based on hearing that knowledge? And maybe it's just a temporary shift because it's a shock to hear that. But there's also, there's the person who's experienced the trauma who has the courage to open up and start sharing about that within their relationship. And then there's the other side of it. And so how can the person receiving that information, if they're feeling really triggered by it, what would be a way for them to get support? Should they talk to their partner about that? Should they possibly see someone outside of the relationship to talk through some of that stuff? I mean, what would you suggest just as a jumping off point? Just like, what would be sort of just a first step to deal with that?
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. One is, yeah, by all means, if you can get support from a coach, a counselor, as a couple, as well as an individual, then that can be so helpful for sure. And it makes sense that you would feel triggered in these circumstances. And it gets back actually to the question that you asked earlier about like what happens when you're in the bedroom and you're in sex and this comes up. And Chloe, started to answer that question. Then we took a detour and talked about the container a little bit more. But this question about, that's why it's so valuable for each person to see this as a healing journey for themselves, as well as for the other person, because those triggers coming up in you as the partner hearing what's being revealed are an indication of your own healing work that needs to happen. So the more that you can show up in that moment with your partner and say, wow, I'm really triggered right now too. Like then you're both probably sitting there triggered. And, that gets into this whole question about like how much of the trigger that you're experiencing is actually your partner's trigger that you're just experiencing for them. That there are all kinds of things possible there. But the acknowledgement that you're feeling triggered and that in that moment, your job is, you have two things that you need to do. The first is acknowledging your trigger and dealing with it. And the second is to also stay present. And your goal is to figure that out. And, there are all kinds of ways that we can help you. And I think it's beyond the scope of the last few minutes of this conversation. But that being said, just as a hint, not leaving is a good idea. Or if you are so triggered that you need a little space, saying something like, okay, I need like 10 minutes to just like be alone and, be in this anger, sadness, fear, whatever, and then I will come back to you, so that it's not like you're just abandoning the situation because you got so freaked out. That's really key. Mm-hmm. And, one thing that we have practiced for ourselves, and that's so helpful for clients that we've worked with, is actually just the act of holding each other for like a really long time can be so therapeutic. So in a moment where, hopefully you can recognize like, okay, I'm really triggered right now, and my partner just is so vulnerable right now and so courageous for having told me this. It's like a perfect moment to just say like, can I hold you? Can we hold each other? This is really hard for me too. Can we just hold each other and be with each other? And then to focus on your breathing and just the sensation, the things that bring you back into the moment, into the room with your partner.
And physiologically, that's really bringing you in alignment together energetically.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. Well, and we could go so much deeper into all of these topics. I'm just so incredibly grateful for your time today. Chloe and Neil, you are a dynamic duo, and I am so grateful that your, universe conspired to bring you two together in these powerful times to do the work that you're doing in the world. Thank you so much for joining us on Ignite Intimacy. And, for our listeners, if you have any questions or insights or stories that you'd like to share based on this topic, please feel free to holler at us. hello@igniteintimacy.com. That's hello@igniteintimacy.com. And again, I just want to thank you both so much for being on the line. Definitely check out Chloe and Neil, thenewloveparadigm.com, and make sure to check out Relationships Alive, Neil's podcast. So thank you both so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having us.
It's been a real pleasure to be here with you, Miss Law. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all for tuning in for another dynamic episode of Ignite Intimacy. Stay blessed, and we'll see you on the next one. Give thanks for tuning in to another conversation on the Ignite Intimacy podcast hotline. We love that you choose to spend your time with us. Check us out online at igniteintimacy.com and subscribe to us on iTunes. Also, tell your friends all about it. This beautiful music was arranged by Jason Pfaff and Mike Corey, and this podcast is produced by yours truly, Miss La. Give thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one. In the meantime, let your light shine bright and ignite your intimacy.